the trend shifted toward creating profit-making commercial banks that sought to replicate ordinary commercial banking, fill that gap. These new banks tried to practice mudaraba on the deposit side without much trouble. But when they turned to using mudaraba for investments, they ran into trouble because of poor accountability in most countries as to profits and loss. So they quickly turned to a different form of investment, the one that actually is shown to be most popular in Islamic economic history. That is various forms of credit sale and lease. And the most heavily used Islamic transaction until today is the so-called markup sale, or murabaha, where the customer asks the bank to purchase some goods for him, and then for cash, and then resell those goods to him on time. So the net effect is credit to purchase some goods. The most important Islamic finance investments today are modeled on this. They are various forms of sale or lease tied to specific assets. So with these developments, Islamic banking came to be understood as focused on private profit and not some kind of, sort of altruistic enterprise or one that was dedicated to the sort of macro goals of Islamic life. Each bank now has Islamic legal scholars advising it, and each one or more serving on an internal Sharia review board vetting the bank's transactions. These scholars, with their expertise in Islamic commercial law, the traditional law, but also in finance, end up being very few. There's very few capable of this. And they have developed a specialty in devising transactions that mimic conventional banking closer and closer. These scholars say that the larger ethical, social, or macroeconomic goals of Islamic economics are either the concerns of others to achieve, or they will follow naturally from the literal application of the old rules. And they take seriously the Islamic presumption in favor of the transaction of permissible absent any specific prohibition. And they also believe that the most permissive attitude is needed for the success of this industry as it competes with conventional banks. They even have made some exceptions on the grounds of necessity, which makes illicit anything in Islamic law, that these banks need to survive, and therefore even un-Islamic behaviors can, as an exception, be tolerated. So in the last few years, these scholars, and you'll hear more about this from Sheikh Yusuf, who has some very strong views on some of these recent innovations. Scholars, with controversy amongst them, have adopted several transactions that have the power to dissolve all the prohibitions. Resolve any remaining differences between Islamic banks and conventional banks, except for transaction costs, particularly tawarruk and profit swaps. Now, tawarruk is where the bank helps the customer arrange to buy some goods of a highly liquid sort, and then helps to buy them on time, and then helps them resell them for cash. Net effect, credit loan. And the goods themselves just move. And they can go move again, and they can move again, and the same goods can be sold many times a day. The profit swaps, well, we won't go into it. I think Sheikh De Lorenzo will. So these have the potential to make any form of credit extension possible. And they're becoming widespread. So now Islamic banks are poised to make the final asymptotic approach to conventional banking. And in fact, are on the poise to adopt all the financial wizardry that are conventional banks. So now, as a final point about the history of the finance industry, we're all wondering, how have they done during the crisis? Professor Warday will talk about this. My impression is that they have suffered less than conventional banks in the downturn. On their face, Islamic legal rules bar banks from indulging in the most of the conventional transactions that exacerbated the crisis: securitization of debts, excessive speculation, most derivatives. They're just out. So Islamic finance has on the face of it a lot to teach the world. And the Islamic economists writing in that vein have done better predicting the crisis than anyone else. Extraordinarily prescient. But two factors mitigate the congratulations. First, many banks just simply hadn't diversified adequately, and they got hit with the economic downturn, particularly in real estate in the Gulf. But more significantly, many of them poised to adopt many of these derivatives and so forth, credit default swaps, just like everyone else. And if they'd had a little more time, they would have been caught just as bad. So this has led to a revival of the long-standing debate. What is the fate of Islamic finance? What is the goal? Should it become like conventional banks? Should it make possible for ordinary Muslims to participate in commercial banking on highly competitive terms, not be at all checked, fail to participate in what is otherwise the economic and financial logic of the world? Or on the other hand, should they set a higher example or a different example and live finance in a way that is more consistent with their Islamic goals and ideas? So let's stop and review the bidding somewhat, where we've come. We started with the earliest ideas of economists who really were thinking systemically in macro terms as ushering, as thought of Islamic finance as ushering in an ideal Islamic system. So there'd be an end to hoarding of wealth, an end to exploiting of the poor, and so forth. But many things have happened along the way, but obviously Islamic finance hasn't come that way, and there remains a sort of a lack of sort of self-awareness about this, and a certain amount of dissatisfaction and debate. So now let's look specifically at the scholar's role in this for the remaining time, and I'll stop whenever I'm told to, I guess. Let's focus on what the scholar's role has been in all this. And I'd partly like to defend the scholars who oftentimes are getting some criticism from those deeply invested in the industry or those who have higher aspirations for it. They have contributed, no doubt, to where we are. They are now the leaders of the industry, the arbiters of the industry. But let's try to look at what they're doing, analyzing it where it fits within the much larger scope of Sharia. Sharia is not just so much commercial and property law. Sharia covers the entirety of life, including governance, politics, ethics, all sorts of things. Also, let's look at it in terms of the wider scope of Islamic legal institutions and merely the individual scholar advising someone. And also in light of Islamic legal history, how Islamic law was conducted in the past. So first, these scholars, have seen themselves for a long time as advisors to conscience. This is an old tradition, old pattern. Muslims approach scholars to get guidance on how to live as individuals, as merchants, and so forth, as well as government officials or whatever, both for this sake of this world and the next. So what the scholars have been doing is they have seen themselves as in this traditional role, first, as advisors to individual private action. Not as, for example, legislators or as moralizers, moralists, preachers, nor as judges. There's often a lot of misunderstanding about that. Other people are going to be the judges and moralists, legislators, community leaders, and so forth. These are one of the possible roles for scholars. Scholars occupied many of those other roles in the past, but the one they've chosen is different. Second, they accept payment for what they do from their customers, the ones who are asking for the advice. This was frowned on in the very beginning of Islamic law, but quickly gave way. Scholars were always compensated. We also have the model of modern auditors and lawyers. Then they have chosen to give permissive fatwas rather than moralizing fatwas. They have focused on avoiding conflict with the rules, looked at very narrowly, very legalistically, almost as stratagems to avoid conflict. That also, by the way, people do not respect this sufficiently. This is an age-old pattern within Islamic law. Abu Yusuf, one of the founders of the Hanafi school, one of the four schools of Islamic law, was famed for advising people on how to use just these stratagems to avoid embarrassment before Sharia while doing what they wanted. I mean, formalistic obedience to divine command is a form of religiosity. And it's very important in Islamic legal history. It somehow doesn't accord with modern preferences, however. We're more rational. We expect explanations for things. So it is odd and is often criticized today. And they've also, as these scholars have felt, that permissive positions were essential for allowing the industry to survive and compete. And then also you have to recognize that they've been asked to achieve Islamicity in the most difficult area, commercial banking.